May and December 1961, there were 63 different groups of freedom riders, and I was in the 63rd group, so I guess this is evidence that the last really can be first at some point. On behalf of all of us, I want to thank everybody in Morristown for the generous and gracious welcome you've given to us. It has been an experience that we will talk about for many years to come, if we are given more years to come. It has just been special. We've met some fabulous students and wonderful school personnel and community people. So, thank you. What I'd like to do, each of us as freedom riders, we share a common experience from a different individual perspective. So what I'd like to do is quickly talk about the impact of the freedom riders and what we actually did. And because you brought us here under educational auspices, I thought it would be interesting to you to tell you some of the educational experiences that prepared me as a South Georgia Southern white girl to be inclined to join the freedom movement and the freedom rides. And then I want to give you the best of what I learned in the freedom movement, which is a little bit about Miss Ella Baker, who's still available to all of us as a guide and a model for activism. Professor Raymond Arsenault devoted 10 years to finding all the freedom riders and produced a 690-page document called The Freedom Rides 1961 and the Struggle for Racial Justice. And let me tell you how he evaluates the freedom rides. He says, quote, "The freedom riders belong in the Oxford Press series called Pivotal Moments in American History because, inspired by visions of social revolution and moral regeneration, these self-proclaimed freedom riders challenged the mores of a racially segregated society by performing a disarmingly simple act. Traveling together in small interracial groups, they sat where they pleased on buses and trains and demanded unrestricted access to terminal restaurants and waiting rooms, even in areas in the Deep South where such behavior was forbidden by local law and custom. They did so knowing that their actions would almost certainly provoke a savage and violent response from militant white supremacists. Invoking the philosophy of nonviolent direct action, they willingly put their bodies on the line for the cause of racial justice. They appeared to court martyrdom with a reckless disregard for personal safety or civic order. None of the obstacles placed in their path, not widespread censure, not political and financial pressure, not arrest and imprisonment, not even the threat of death, seemed to weaken their commitment to nonviolent struggle. And indeed, we did believe that we might be murdered, we might be dead. But as Dr. King so eloquently spoke in Birmingham as the police dogs were biting children and water cannons were tearing garments and flesh from their bodies, Dr. King said, "But I submit to you tonight that no man is free if he fears death. But the minute you conquer the fear of death, the moment you are free, you can say somehow, I may not have much money, I may not have much education, I may not even be able to read and write, but in the cause of freedom, I have the capacity to die." And as a personal note, I conquered the fear of death when I almost drowned at the age of 11. I was going up and down in water, and I remember thinking, this is what dying is like, and it's not so bad. Of course, I didn't die, and soon after that experience at the age of 11, our little Methodist preacher came and had a conversation with me, after which I understood that death of this physical body is just transition from a temporary to an eternal existence. And so I've not been afraid of death, although except for the freedom rides, I haven't actively courted it. And further quoting from Dr. Arsenault about the impact of the freedom rides, quote, "The most important and lasting consequence, the one that confirmed the freedom ride status as a pivotal moment in American history, was a revolutionary change in the character of citizen politics. In the course of 6 months, the nation's first mobile nonviolent army expanded the realm of the possible in American politics and social insurgency. They redefined the limits of dissent and set the stage for the escalating demands and rising expectations of the mid and late 1960s. And more than any other activist of the day, they foreshadowed the grassroots rights revolution that would transform American citizenship. The lesson of the rides was the ability of ordinary citizens to affect public policy. They proved that even a small vanguard of activists could initiate fundamental change through righteous active action and moral discipline. And we were called, one of our number, Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan, calls us the birthing movement. We birthed the environmental movement and the disability rights movement and the second wave feminist movement and other movements came out of and patterned after what we did. And that's pretty heavy stuff for a group of 19, 20-year-olds to do. So that's what Dr. Arsenault says was important about the freedom rides. Now, I grew up in southern Georgia, just not very far north of the Florida border, in a very white community, of course, in a white family. And so for me to find my way into the civil rights movement and the freedom rides was a different kind of path than many people. And because you brought us here to talk to students, I'd like to talk about some of the early educational influences. Teachers and the books that they urged me to read helped me to see that racial segregation was evil. For example, one of the most harrowing stories that I read in the 6th grade in a history of Telfair County, Georgia, where I was in school, has remained with me all these years. When I started thinking about writing and talking about my experiences as a freedom rider, I sat down and tried to remember the early influences, and this was one that came to the front of my mind. This was about my county's infamy as the place where the last and, of course, illegal crew of Africans were brought to be enslaved. They were brought on the slave ship Wanderer, which had landed at Jekyll Island, Georgia, and then they were smuggled up the Ocmulgee River to the county where I lived. And here's the story from that book that has stuck with me all these years. This woman was talking about a story her grandmother had told her. Her grandmother was 5 years old when she landed in Telfair County. And she said, Granny said that one Sunday evening, a crowd of her friends and relatives went out to hunt guinea eggs in Africa. And while they were hunting eggs, they came to the big water and they saw a big boat with sails, and some white men came up to them and gave them strips of red flaming cloth. The white men told them if they wanted more cloth, come on the ship and get it. So they went on the ship, and then the ship took off, and they were locked in a dark hole in the ship and never saw daylight again until they reached this country and were made slaves to the white folks. Well, as a farm girl, one of my jobs was to go find the eggs that the hens would lay in the weeds and the bushes and in the hayloft. And so I could imagine myself out doing my routine job of hunting eggs, and somebody would offer me some trinket, and I could be lured away from my family and taken to a foreign country and made a slave. So I essentially, as a 6th grader, I could take a walk a mile in that 5-year-old child's shoes. So for me, slavery at that point stopped being an abstraction. It was about real people. When I started trying to write about myself, I said, I'm going to see if I can find out more about this 5-year-old child who was kidnapped and brought to be a slave in my county. I found a book of The Wanderer, and I didn't find this 5-year-old, but I did learn more about that ship. In 1858, it landed in the Congo River, where it loaded 487 young Africans. At least 80 died in the 6-week voyage to Georgia. And in 1908, the University of Chicago sent anthropologists to study African Americans along the Georgia and South Carolina coast who had been born in Africa. They found one named Ward Lee, well, they found several, but Ward Lee told his story, and then he posted a notice in the newspaper. He said, "Please help me. In 1859, I was brought to this country when I was a child. I cannot say just what age I was then, but a year ago it was revealed to me to go back home to Africa." And he begs people to help him finance his trip back to Africa. "I am bound for my old home. I am an old African." And he signed it Ward Lee. And Ward Lee died 10 years after he put this notice in the paper without ever returning to Africa. But they did find two of his sons had bought a farm, and then his family started migrating north. A grandson moved to Brooklyn, and others moved further out on Long Island. And I was interested that his great-great-granddaughters, he had twin great-great-granddaughters who were the first African Americans who were the double mint gum twins, and billboards with their pictures all over the country. So while I didn't find the 5-year-old who came to my county, I was able to put a human face on some of the people who came on that ship with her. And that was very important to me, and I still will keep looking for information about Aunt Tiny.
Okay.
In high school, after the state of Georgia decided that if you're going to make schools equal so that we can keep them separate, they started spending a lot of new money. And my little high school of 100 students suddenly got a science lab, which we had not had before. But we didn't have any science equipment. So for the first half of the year, the chemistry teacher read us Pearl Buck's wonderful book, The Good Earth. And that was, in a sense, my first contact with people from another country. Okay, I'm going to run through some titles. Lillian Smith, Killers of the Dream, W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks, and Henry David Thoreau's Walden Pond, which is a thin little book, so always in the back they included his essay on civil disobedience. Who do I turn this to?